Hello and welcome to the Cloud Computing School YouTube channel. In this video, we will go through Module 1 of the Microsoft AZ-140 exam preparation course. We will first cover the theory of AZ-140, Module 1. Then we will provide some hands-on demonstrations and a live Azure subscription to further explain the topics discussed. We now move to the AZ-140 course outline. AZ-140 course comprises the following modules. Module 1, Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture. Module 2, Design the Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture. Module 3, Design for User Identities and Profiles. Module 4, Implement and Manage Networking for Azure Virtual Desktop. Module 5, Implement and Manage Storage for Azure Virtual Desktop. Module 6, Create and configure host pools and session hosts for Azure Virtual Desktop. Module 7, Create and manage session host image for Azure Virtual Desktop. Module 8, Manage access for Azure Virtual Desktop. Module 9, Manage security for Azure Virtual Desktop. Module 10, Implement and manage FS logics. Module 11, Configure user experience settings. Module 12, Install and configure apps on a session host. Module 13, Plan for Azure Virtual Desktop disaster recovery. Module 14, Automate Azure Virtual Desktop management tasks. Module 15, Monitor and manage performance and health. We now move to the Module 1 outline for course AZ-140. Module 1 comprises the following lessons. Lesson 1, Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture. Lesson 2, Azure Virtual Desktop Components. Lesson 3, Personal and Pooled Desktops. Lesson 4, Service Updates for Azure Virtual Desktop Desktops. Lesson 5, Azure Limitations for Azure Virtual Desktop. Lesson 6, Virtual Machine Sizing for Azure Virtual Desktop. Lesson 7, Azure Virtual Desktop Pricing. Module 1 of course AZ-140 covers the following learning objectives. Explain the Azure Virtual Desktop components. Describe the Azure Virtual Desktop architecture. Choose between personal and pooled desktops. Identify the Azure limitations for Azure Virtual Desktop. Describe the options for Azure Virtual Desktop pricing. Now let's dive into Module 1 lessons. The first lesson covers Azure Virtual Desktop architectural aspects. Azure Virtual Desktop architecture comprises the following components. Microsoft Entra ID as the authentication and authorization platform for all users connecting to Azure Virtual Desktop. The Azure Virtual Desktop control plane, which is the plane managed by Microsoft. It comprises the following Azure Virtual Desktop components: Web Access, Gateway, Broker, Diagnostics, and REST API. An on-premises network which includes the on-prem Active Directory domain controllers with the Entra ID Connect agent, a VPN gateway connecting to Azure, and the AVD endpoints running a remote desktop client. RDP endpoints can be connecting also from any other internet location. The on-prem location can be thought of as a spoke node for the Azure Hub VNet, as explained later on. Azure Hub Virtual Network, VNet. This virtual network is the central point in a hub-and-spoke VNet configuration, and it comprises the Azure VPN gateway to connect to on-prem networks, a network virtual appliance operating in a DMZ subnet, intra-domain services operating in a separate subnet, and a series of Azure Virtual Desktop session machines operating in a separate desktop subnet. This Hub VNet is integrated with Azure Files and/or Azure NetApp file storage accounts, where the AVD session machine images and remote desktop user data and profiles are stored. Desktop Spoke Virtual Network. This includes a separated desktop subnet where AVD session machines are hosted. This VNet has VNet peering enabled with the Hub VNet. Azure Files or Azure NetApp Files. This is the repository for AVD session machine images and remote desktop user data and profiles. Now let's move on to Lesson 2. In this lesson, we will present the Azure Virtual Desktop components in more detail. Some of the AVD components are managed by Microsoft as part of the AVD control plane, and some others are managed by the customer. The Microsoft-managed AVD components are the following: Web Access, Gateway, Connection Broker, Diagnostics, and Extensibility components. Web Access controls connections coming from a web browser. Gateway is the AVD reverse proxy component, which acts as AVD application gateway for external users. The Gateway component is hosted in a DMZ network zone, VNet subnet. Connection Broker is the internal AVD server role which brokers connections coming from the Gateway or Web Access components to the internal AVD session machines. Diagnostics describes all components which are integrated with Azure Monitor to collect operations information from all AVD components for monitoring and troubleshooting purposes. Finally, there are some extensibility components based on PowerShell modules and on the AVD REST API, which can be used to extend the functionality of AVD or integrate it to third-party services. The customer-managed AVD components are the following: Azure Virtual Network, Microsoft Entra ID, Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS, Azure Virtual Desktop Session Hosts with various VM sizes and images, Azure Virtual Desktop Workspaces, Azure Files, and AVD Clients. It is important to note that, regardless of your topology and architecture, Azure Virtual Desktop virtual machines require an Active Directory Domain Services infrastructure to be joined into. Now let's discuss the differences between personal and pooled desktops. An Azure Virtual Desktop host pool comprises one or more session host machines. Each session machine can run the following operating systems: Windows 10 Enterprise, Windows 11 Enterprise, Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session, Windows Server 2012 or 2 and above. Any custom Windows system image with a preloaded set of apps, group policies, or other customizations. Each session machine has an AVD session host agent installed in it, so as for it to be manageable from the AVD control plane components. There are two types of session host pools, namely pooled and personal, also known as persistent pools. You typically configure a pooled host pool for several users to sign in and share a VM. These users would not be local administrators on the pooled VM. Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session and Windows Server are the recommended options when working with pooled host pools. You can always bring your own multi-session operating system image, of course. Personal, persistent host pools, on the other hand, allow each user to be allocated their own dedicated VM. These users would typically be local administrators for their allocated VM. This means that each user can install or uninstall apps, save files, and generally persist their desktop state. There are several options for updating Azure Virtual Desktop desktops. The Microsoft recommendation is to update each Azure Virtual Desktop image once every month to cover security, compliance, and virtual desktop state update requirements. The following methods can be used to apply updates in an Azure Virtual Desktop image. Microsoft Configuration Manager, MCM, can update both server and desktop operating systems. Windows Updates for Business can update client operating systems. Azure Update Management can update server operating systems. Also, Azure Log Analytics can be used to carry out periodic checks for compliance of the session host machines. Please note that session host images can be found either in the Azure Marketplace or as custom Azure Managed images. There are certain limitations in the Azure Virtual Desktop service, which you should be aware of when planning a new AVD infrastructure. Taking these limitations into account is a very good idea in order to avoid to have to make design changes during production operations. The most important limitations that you need to be aware of when designing an Azure Virtual Desktop solution are the following: maximum number of workspaces, maximum number of host pools, maximum number of application groups, Maximum number of remote apps. Maximum number of role assignments. Maximum number of session host servers. Other Azure limitations may be present at the Azure subscription level, region level, or at the resource group level. In some cases, increasing the capacity of a certain AVD metric, such as for example the maximum number of application groups, you can raise a support ticket to the Azure Virtual Desktop team via the Azure portal. For more details on Azure service limitations, refer to Microsoft Learn article entitled Azure Subscription and Service Limits, Quotas, and Constraints. At this point, we will discuss some basic capacity planning considerations which you need to make when sizing your Azure Virtual Desktop host pools and host pool session host machines. Firstly, you need to review the Microsoft guidelines for RDS and Azure Virtual Desktop capacity planning. These guidelines explain the recommended maximum number of users per virtual CPU, vCPU, as well as the minimum virtual machine family and number for any given scenario. The following virtual machine families are available in Azure: Entry-level, A Series; Burstable, B Series; General Purpose and Confidential Computing; Compute Intensive; Memory Optimized; Storage Optimized; GPU Accelerated; High Performance Computing, HPC. Depending on the types of applications that the users will be running, you need to organize your users into application groups, each having a unique workload level, i.e., light, medium, heavy, or power workload. Also, you need to evaluate your scenario and determine whether you will be using single-session versus multi-session host machines. Last but not least, we will discuss a few items to remember when it comes to minimizing your Azure Virtual Desktop costs. In order to plan for your AVD costs, you should first define your target audience of AVD users. The most common practical applications where AVD remote apps and desktops are required are the following: security and regulation applications like financial services, healthcare, and government; elastic workforce needs like remote work, mergers and acquisition, short-term employees, contractors, and partner access; specific employees like bring your own device, BYOD, and mobile users, call centers, and branch workers; specialized workloads like design and engineering, legacy apps, and software development test. In order to minimize AVD costs, there are some considerations which can be made. Utilizing Windows 10 multi-session images can help you achieve greater density of your session machines and achieve better economy of scale as compared to Windows 10 single session. If you already have Microsoft Software Assurance, SA, as part of another Microsoft component you have already licensed on-premise, you can use these licenses, for example for Windows 10 or Windows Server, to license the AVD session virtual machines in Azure as part of the Azure Hybrid benefit. Also, if you are willing to commit to 1-year or 3-year usage of the AVD service, you can purchase one or more Azure Reserved Instances, RI, and get great discounts. Last but not least, you should strongly consider using the Depth First load balancing mode instead of the Breadth First. In Breadth First, which is used by default, new AVD sessions are distributed evenly to free AVD session machines in a horizontal fashion. In Depth First load balancing mode, firstly, all available resources are used in the first session machine to reach full session capacity, and only then, the second, third, etc. session machine starts to get utilized. This can definitely get you a better economy of scale and reduce costs. Always consider your other priorities, however, such as performance and high availability, as part of your unique infrastructure and application architecture needs. Now, let's briefly go over a recap of the AZ-140 Module 1 contents, which we covered in this presentation. Lesson 1, Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture. Lesson 2, Azure Virtual Desktop Components. Lesson 3, Personal and Pooled Desktops. Lesson 4, Service Updates for Azure Virtual Desktop Desktops. Lesson 5, Azure Limitations for Azure Virtual Desktop. Lesson 6, Virtual Machine Sizing for Azure Virtual Desktop. Lesson 7, Azure Virtual Desktop Pricing. Refer to the following Microsoft Learn page to study the official AZ-140 course curriculum online. https://go.cloudcomputing.school/mslearn-az140. To put what you learned into action, please review the separate video available as a link at the end of this presentation. In that video, you should familiarize yourself with the hands-on procedure for deploying a new Azure Virtual Desktop infrastructure with default settings and minimal configuration, in order to get a functional remote desktop up and running and ready to accept RDP connections. More detailed configuration considerations and scenarios will be covered in later AZ-140 modules and will be accompanied by respective demonstration videos in the Cloud Computing School YouTube channel. Thank you for watching this presentation. Please subscribe to the Cloud Computing School YouTube channel for more videos like this.